Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. It is about 1:30. We'll just give about 30 seconds to a minute longer for people to join, and then we will be right with you and we'll start. Thank you. All right, everybody. Good afternoon again. My name is Sasha Chilkova. I'm a marketing manager here for Withum at Withum Digital. I'm joined by Jill Hannemann today for our webinar, Office 365 and Knowledge Management, Creating a Strategy for the Enterprise. Let me just go over a couple of housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded. We will provide a link to the recording and a copy of the slide deck shortly after the webinar today. If you have any questions or comments throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit that in the questions pane of the GoToWebinar panel or in the chat there, and I'll be able to answer that. And we'll leave questions to the end, but we'll make sure to leave some time. We'll keep the session to 45-50 minutes and address your questions at the end. So with that, Jill, if you'd like to get started.
All right, sounds good. Hello, everyone. I hope you are having a good Thursday in January. I am coming to you from Seattle, Washington, so it's still morning my time. So I hope your afternoon is kicking off really well. So just a little bit about me. I'm a principal with our Withum Digital Group, and I've been in the knowledge management space for 10 plus years. So we focus and we work very closely with Office 365 and Microsoft technologies, but I've worked with other portal platforms and other content management systems, and really love how technology is able to bring together knowledge management concepts of knowledge retention, knowledge storage, and knowledge reuse. So whenever I look at the new products and I look at what Microsoft is coming out with for Office 365, I always kind of have it with this lens on, and how does this make it easier for organizations to capture knowledge? How does it make it easier for them to manage unstructured data? And what are some techniques that we can apply? What are still the challenges that exist for organizations in being able to implement these principles effectively? So just a personal tidbit, anyone who's seen some of my presentations before knows that I really like to cook, and I really like food a lot. So right now I'm in the process of working on a lot of eggless savories and sweets, mainly because my little one, my 16-month-old, is allergic to eggs. So trying to make sure that he gets a wide variety of foods and trying different recipes to make them work for his diet. So if you have any suggestions, all ears, and always interested in learning more things. So just a little bit about who Withum Digital is. We are an organization. We've been in business for about 16 years. And as a result, our history is deeply embedded with the Microsoft solution stack. So we started working with SharePoint back before SharePoint was SharePoint. And as a result, we've done over 400 plus implementations of SharePoint and Office 365. So we are very experienced in this area. And we have a lot of different experts in the different disciplines surrounding the platform. Withum itself is, I think this says 900, but I think we're actually about 1,100 professionals. And within the Withum Digital team, there's about 50 of us who are working and working with technology and productivity tools. All right, so getting into the subject matter for our presentation today, we're going to be talking about developing a knowledge management strategy for Office 365. So I really like to start off the presentation with this slide. This is what I call my 30,000 foot view slide of the ecosystem that is Office 365. It's intentionally crowded in here, and as I'm sure many of you are aware, there are so many different products and apps and workloads that come with the suite when you sign up for your licensing. So I'm going to use a term throughout this presentation of workload. It's a term that we derived from Microsoft, as they used the term workload to describe some of the services and the features and functionality that they've grouped together into some of these different applications, for lack of a better term. So when I refer to a workload, I'm talking about OneDrive for Business, I'm talking about Delve as a separate workload, I'm talking about SharePoint Online as a separate workload, Exchange and Outlook as a separate workload. So I realize that that term isn't ubiquitous across everybody who uses Office 365, so I just wanted to make sure that I made that clarification. So, you know, when you look at this, you know, a couple things kind of come to mind. You know, there may be maybe one or two reasons that drove your organization to adopting Office 365. It may have been cost. It may have been the licensing that your Microsoft rep presented to you. You may be moving Exchange and email into the cloud. You may be looking to just move all of your existing SharePoint into SharePoint Online. And likewise, this may be the first time you've ever had access to SharePoint. So for whatever the reason is, we all have very similar motivations. And one of those motivations is how can we maximize our value out of this platform? And now that we have access to so many really rich and sophisticated tools, how do we leverage these tools to improve our digital workplace, to improve the knowledge management that we have within our organizations? And so that's really where we get this conversation from, and trying to understand exactly how does Office 365 fit within your organization. So I mentioned the digital workplace, and I want to start off here with our conversation because ultimately I'm going to be talking quite a bit about what is your digital workplace and how the definition of that helps to influence your knowledge management practices and the scheme and the strategy that you have around it, but likewise what your governance is going to be and how you communicate the governance of Office 365 to the rest of your organization. So when you look at this circle graphic that I have in the middle here, you'll notice each one of these circles, so project management, Microsoft Office, workflow, websites, and around, all represent different workloads that exist in Office 365. So there is a workload for each one of these pieces, and it represents a different need of information management within your organization. And then likewise, all of this should be able to be consumed either on a mobile, a tablet, or through a web browser. So when you start to think about mapping this out or starting to figure out what is your digital workplace, I like to think of it in these terms. And when we're looking at our own digital workplace within Withum Digital and at Withum, and also for different customers that we have, this is just one way of starting to think about, how are you going to be using the workloads and how does it align to the organization? And then larger question, what is your digital workplace and what other business applications fit in with this? So the contents of this particular digital workplace map is very focused on Office 365, but I do want to highlight this section over here on the right for business applications, for any other business critical applications that may not be a part of the Office 365 suite. And so, you know, creating that landscape is a great way of being able to communicate when do you use what tool within Office 365, and how will you be using each of the different workloads and in what circumstances. How do you communicate that? How do you train people? And how are you able to derive the most value out of the platform while in a governed way, in a thoughtful way that responds to business needs and values. All right, so building your KM strategy with Office 365, we are going to start this off with a poll. So the question I have for you all is, what KM challenge are you looking to solve? And this will give me a little context of the conversation and where we're going. So Sasha, I think you launched it.
I did launch it. I'm just waiting on a few more people to vote.
Okay, I actually can't see it.
Okay.
So
So we have about 30% in the figuring out what to use when for Office 365. About second runner-up is improving content management tied with improving collaboration. That's where we're seeing the numbers. Yep.
Very good. Okay, well then I think you guys are in the right place, because it turns out that a good amount of what we have to talk about today will be about what to use when and content management and collaboration. So very good. All right. Are you all able to see the screen again?
I think we're back. Yep, everything's good.
Good. All right. Awesome. So we are looking at the value of Office 365 now. And this is kind of an old slide. And in terms of Office 365 and its age, it's relatively old. This is a slide from Microsoft that they put out, gosh, maybe 2.5 years ago or something. It feels a lifetime ago, where they were aiming to describe the different workloads and group them by function. So a function of communication, a function of making your knowledge workers more mobile, the function of social, desktop, content, and insights. And so I still think that a lot of this holds true in the way we look at Office 365 today. And it's really those concepts that I wanted to draw out when we think about the digital workplace and knowledge management in the digital workplace. Okay. I think that PowerPoint just crashed on me. That's a real endorsement for Microsoft tools right there.
It happens.
All right, give me a second to pick back up where we left off. Okay. I think we're back.
We're good.
Okay, cool. All right. Okay, so going back to knowledge management for the digital workplace, I like to think about it in these 4 quadrants, that we're looking at ways that we can improve communication, ways to improve content management and unstructured content management, information sharing, and how do we improve communication between everyone in your workforce, from the top down, from the bottom up, from peer to peer. And then lastly, process, and how that is streamlined, how process influences productivity and our ability to regain perhaps some minutes that we used to spend doing tasks that took a long time. So how that translates then into actual KM topics and KM principles, I've grouped them out in this way. So in the communication bucket, you know, our goals are to capture tacit knowledge, improve transparency, accessibility, and responsiveness. We want to retain that knowledge. And then on the content management side, we're also looking to retain knowledge, but it's more about findability, it's more about searchability and improving that ease of use, capturing knowledge and making sure that we're reusing it and not reinventing the wheel again. And then down in the information sharing quadrant, I think of this more so in kind of a top-down awareness, information sharing perspective. So how does your organization communicate its mission, vision, and strategy to the workforce? How does that culture get developed? How does everyone stay in touch with one another on policies, procedures, and guidelines for standard operating procedures and how the organization is intended to be run and what compliance measures you are tied to? And then finally, the services. I think this is really big, that what services does your workforce, your knowledge workers need as employees, and how do you provide those services to them? So this also sort of ties to the process end that I was talking about, and task management, project management. How do we influence time savings and efficiency in making processes move faster because of the technology that we have at our fingertips? So then, we take this conversation and we take this concept one step further, and we start to think about what are some of the functions or the architecture, I suppose we could say, of, how do we influence those attributes? How do we achieve those attributes? How do we get to the tacit knowledge capture, reuse, better efficiency, task management, better communication? So that's where we look in the communication quadrant. This is influenced in conversations and the introduction of persistent chatting, microblogging, instant messaging, email. Content management, where do we store the content? How accessible are those repositories to other users? How do we ensure that the final version is trusted and everyone knows where to go to find those documents? What's our metadata? And how does metadata influence search? And is metadata applied consistently? Do we need metadata? And again, for a KM person, you never ask a KM person, do you need metadata? But anyway, it's up there, and I pose the question. So then going down into information, sharing your corporate intranet, corporate communications, organizational policies, human resources, or other employee services, and how do we bring those to the forefront and make those services accessible? And then process, your customer interactions, sales, business applications, business processes. So as we start to think about Office 365 now, we've kind of gone through this thought process where we've identified what our goals are, we've identified how that manifests in technology, and now we're starting to look at, okay, what workloads in Office 365 may align best to respond to these needs. And so from a communication perspective, we really see it in the use of Skype for Business, the use of Teams, and the use of Yammer. And then I didn't include Outlook email, but obviously Outlook and email would be a part of this communication bucket as well. And then, we aren't going to really dive into this very much just because everything is changing and the timeline, is a little uncertain as to when we're going to see more maturity in Teams, in the replacement of Teams from Skype for Business. So we're not going to hit too much on that, but we'll acknowledge that we know that that's in the future and it's coming. And then from content management, we have Teams, we have OneDrive for Business, we have SharePoint Online, and we have Video Stream. And then the Video Stream is essentially your video library to host and store videos. From an information sharing standpoint, the best resource for that is really going to be in SharePoint Online, and leveraging SharePoint Online as the website interface for those pieces. You could perhaps look at some of the other workloads and get creative in how you could leverage them to present and share this information and to institute these types of functions. But SharePoint is a logical choice. And then from process, we'll get to that a little bit more. Obviously, there is Power Apps, and there are third-party workflow solutions, CRM, etc., dynamic CRM. So now, going back to mapping out our digital workplace, you know, this is one of the ways that you can start to build your own digital workplace map and figuring out the what to use when question. So, you know, I highlight the top level buckets of content, communication, business applications, and process. And here's where you can start to detail out how you're going to, you know, how you're aligning these different workloads with your plan. And some of the workloads may appear in multiple areas, and that's okay. But the idea here is, you know, beyond the plus sign, you can start to detail out what the expected usage of that workload will be and put those expected usage terms in context with your organization. An example of this, and you could always go back a couple of slides where I have the bigger diagram and I have the children, these plus signs expanded to see more of the detail of some examples here. But for OneDrive for Business, for example, it is content management, and it's an individual document repository, content repository, and it's intended to be that individual repository if it's not, if, you know, and you're sharing content with maybe 1 to 3 different people, but it's not really intended to be, we're going to keep it here and then we're going to broadcast it and share it with the whole department. So, you know, you can lay out some of those terms, and that starts giving you your governance, some of the governance that you need to define and how, you know, what to use when. So continuing that conversation of selecting the right workload for the right job, we do have, unfortunately, I think we may have, I may have a bit of an error, Sasha, with I think some of the, with these 2 slides. So maybe, I'm sorry guys, I think in the editing process, I got a little confused. I have 2 different tables trying to evaluate the workload capability of these items. So we have some of that in here now, and document management for the different workloads. So, you know, maturity model, it's appropriate, it meets needs, it covers most needs, it fully meets expectations. So these are just a few of my own assessments of the tools based on the level of maturity of the product in its current form. And so that's not to say that these tools won't get more mature. And I think the areas where I'm most critical are really within teams, because a lot of improvements are coming out for teams. And while it hasn't been the most mature and it has, you know, the backbones of a very mature SharePoint framework, the user interface still doesn't have all of the legs that I think it's going to be getting in the next year. So some things to keep in mind as you look at, you know, how I rated items, but this is just a good way of, you know, taking some thoughts, you know, from someone who uses these tools a lot and leverages them with a lot of different organizations, and to think about how you might use these different workloads for some of these different usage scenarios. So again, we have some of the similar usage scenarios, and I believe I have a different slide that we'll slip in when we send this deck out to everybody else. So your task in all this and your action items in promoting knowledge management with Office 365, the truth of the matter is that Office 365 workloads closely align with communication and content exchanges. So it does do very well with information sharing, and it's one of the purposes of SharePoint, that people have been consuming SharePoint for the last 16, 17 years. But when you look at improving communication and content, that's where the workloads are going to be most responsive for you. In the business process area or business critical applications, you may not find a whole lot relative to the Microsoft suite. And I think that this is where you could find some band-aids in creating apps with Power Apps, or leveraging Yammer to improve communication and knowledge exchange. But it will not necessarily replace business critical applications. And ultimately, your digital workplace should be composed of those business critical applications with some of these other Office 365 tools supporting an improved method of communication, knowledge retention, tacit knowledge capture, and content exchange and sharing. So the usage of Office 365 and the what to use when conversation is really only the first half in figuring out what your knowledge management strategy is. And I like to think of it as taking that 30,000-foot view of Office 365 and putting your own stamp on it and saying, this is how we are using all of these workloads. And that is the purpose of the mapping exercise. So the second half of this conversation really revolves around design, governance, and change management for your KM strategy. And that's really, where rubber starts to hit the road. So we've kind of, at this point, we've figured out what workloads we're going to use and what we're going to do. And now we're going to start figuring out more on design. So I am going to touch on communication in the digital workplace. I'm sure many of you on this call have seen the really awesome graphic that came out of Ignite this year. And it's one of the first times that we're seeing Microsoft actually be prescriptive with its recommendations for how and when to use their tools. And that's been a gripe of mine ever since Office 365 came out, that they're giving you so much power, they're giving you so many really great resources, but they're not necessarily telling you how and why to and when to use these. So they gave us these thoughts of your inner loop of the people that you work with on a daily basis. And I liken this to your core teams, your project teams. Even within a department, these are the people that you work with on a daily basis and very closely. In your outer loop, that is where you may have a larger department, or you are connecting across the organization, but you are all still within the same umbrella. And then lastly, outside of your organization, these are your partners, your volunteers, your customers, or depending on how you work with people. So anyone that you have to interact with that is not a part of your domain. And so from that, I'm using these concepts with regard to communication and where you start a conversation, because generally where you start a conversation is where that conversation is going to live. So example, if you send an email, your reply is going to come back via email, and your counter reply to that will be an email, and now you have an email conversation chain. So the conversation will continue to live in email. As opposed to you start the question, you ask the question, you start the conversation in Yammer, and then you get replies, or you get likes, and you get feedback through Yammer. But yet that conversation will continue to live in Yammer, and it'll be searchable, and it'll have greater transparency to the rest of the members of that particular group. So these are a few of, or of how I'm aligning the workloads for the inner loop, outer loop, and outside of the organization. And again, this isn't necessarily something you have to live by, but obviously there's strengths and weaknesses of each of the different workloads and what it was intended to be used for. And this is really how we're starting to look at the workloads and how it influences those KM topics of improving tacit knowledge retention, improving transparency, improving all of those KM topics that we're really looking to achieve. So in the inner loop, you may notice that email is not present, and that's intentional. Email and those types of conversations should be existing in a persistent chat interface, and you get persistent chat leveraging MS Teams. I also put in groups here, and this is obviously a much larger conversation, depending on what your interest is and what your users are comfortable with. But groups are still there. It's not going to receive the same amount of investment from a user interface perspective that Teams will be getting, but it's still on par, and it's an option. I would gravitate more towards Teams, but I wanted to list it here on the off chance that there are folks out there who are considering it, so that you get some ideas from an outside person. So with your outer loop, different conversations may leverage different types of workloads. So telephone, Skype for Business, email, and then we have Teams and groups, and now I've added Yammer into this. And I'll also show you in a few other slides where I really see Yammer playing in. And then outside of your organization, email is probably number one still, but you can also create SharePoint sites with external access to SharePoint sites, and Teams, creating a team with external access capability, and then of course telephone. So coming up with this matrix, coming up with this definition of how, where do you start a conversation is a great communication tool to help train your users to leverage these new tools and help you to achieve some of those KM concepts, those goals that we're looking to achieve. So where should I start a conversation? Have a definition for, when do you use Outlook email? When do you use a persistent chat, Teams conversation? Then there's, kind of that conversation. There's that idea around Teams chat versus Skype for Business chat, and which one you're going to go with. And at this point, we have customers of ours who we're starting to just point down the Teams channel. They were never Skype for Business users, and rather than getting their users acquainted with one technology only for them to have to transition to another, we're just starting to point them down the Teams channel. So leveraging Teams for chat, and then you can also leverage Skype for Business for telephony. And then Yammer threads for knowledge exchange, posting comments, questions, notable items. So putting together some kind of guide like this is really valuable for your users and where they start those conversations. So now jumping into content management. So defining your content repositories kind of takes us one step deeper than just simply saying we're going to be using, that SharePoint is one of our content management repositories, OneDrive for Business is one of our content management repositories. And what this does is we're now taking not only the workload and saying this is how you're going to use the workload, we're also saying this is the type of content, and these are the, this is the business scenario in which you will use this workload. So we have our inner loop, we have our outer loop, and we also have outside of the organization, and with a little padlock to make sure that we're secure and that people are authenticating. But in our inner loop, you know, we have OneDrive for Business for your individual content, and we also have Teams for your active project team content. So you have your individual repositories, and then you have your team repositories. Then when you get into the outer loop, and you'll notice that department content is kind of sitting on the borderline, because I think that departments and the interactions could be inner loop or outer loop or some of both. And video libraries may also be inner loop, outer loop as well. But we have contribution of our active project team content to our department content. And then, you know, in the outer loop, we have our knowledge base where our final documents go to rest and reside. And we have our communities of practice. And we also have electronic records. And so your organization may have more repositories. You may have different repositories. You may not need communities of practice. You may not need knowledge base. You may still need records, but you know, it's really to have that conversation with yourselves and figure out what do you think you would need out of this, out of these repositories that you want to set up from an architecture perspective. And then lastly, up here in the right-hand corner, we have Yammer. And this would be our organization-wide social collaboration networks. I think that a good deal of knowledge exchange could exist here, and I think that there is some overlap with communities of practice from a knowledge perspective. But the use of Yammer here is that it's not a document management system. It's not for small team collaboration and aligning persistent chat with work products. It's more so about just communication and exchanging information, posting links, other resources that people may want to find. So a couple ideas here could be that you want to have, you know, a yellow pages and internal classifieds for people who want to post. You know, I have tickets to the baseball game that's coming up. If anybody wants them, you know, post that here. To, you know, we are all knowledge management experts, and I read a really awesome article on knowledge management that I want my other knowledge management professionals and experts to also see. So I can post that link there. So we see Yammer kind of separate in a separate use case, but I like to think of it as an outer loop tool because of the level of transparency that we're trying to achieve. So now we start getting into governance of these repositories and thinking through how do we manage these, and what kind of policies and security do we need to put into place in order to make this an effective model. So you just saw the model, but now let's figure out how do we manage the model. So we have our individual content all the way up to our enterprise content with records at the top. So we have our working content, temporary content in the individual content, and then up to the teams and project content. Oops, sorry. Went one forward, all the way up to records that would be more permanent content. So as we start to think through the information architecture for workspaces, because this is the biggest challenge, I think, with adopting Teams and adopting Yammer and figuring out how these pieces fit into the overall architecture. You know, I'm getting a lot of questions of, you know, how do we thoughtfully govern this so that we are thoughtful about our design, we are managing the growth, and people are able to find teams, they're able to find channels easily, and they understand very clearly the difference between a team and Yammer, and when you are in a Yammer group. Because there's a lot of confusion between all of these because we have so many tools. And it's great that we have a lot of options, and we want derive value from this, but we do need to make sure that we're thinking about the information architecture and what boundaries we need to have without stifling the use of these tools. So in general, these are intentionally less rigid. You will have more rigidity for your document and content repositories that may live in SharePoint. And especially as the content becomes more of an enterprise focus, you are going to have more rigidity and more rules and governance and process associated with those content pieces. But with Teams and with Yammer, you want to have, and with team sites or groups, you want to have more of that fluidity. But at the same time, you do want to think about what the creation process is. And especially because it's so easy to create these objects, and you want to make sure that we're able to create, and users are able to create these quickly, but we're managing and applying some type of control around how they're created. So topical integrity. There's this idea too that with teams, it's so easy to create a team that you could just create a team that someone else created for the same exact topic. So how do we manage that? And what process can we put into place here? This also gets into naming conventions. Because of the group architecture, we have a lot of dependency on naming being really important, because if something is already named something, a team site is already named one name, and you try to then create a group with the same name, you are going to receive conflict and error. So establishing a naming convention actually, I think, has never been more important in working through how you set up teams for your organization. And then the last piece for security, access, and membership. Teams has very little granularity as far as security, access, and membership. They're really only about 3 levels, guest, member, and admin. And then, from a creation standpoint, by default, any user with a license is able to create a new team. So I always recommend that you run the PowerShell script that allows you to align creation with a specific security group within Office 365 administration, and then you manage it that way. But then also figuring out membership and how do you create membership, what constitutes a private versus a public team, etc. So there are nuances that you want to think about. And while it's really easy to open this up and get started, I do recommend thinking about what are the risks, what are the rewards of this, and the push and pull in making this easy for folks to use, but sustainable for findability and management later on down the road. All right, so creating your information architecture now. We're starting to talk a little bit more about SharePoint, SharePoint Online, and modern sites. So modern sites are really the direction that you should consider going. If you're not already headed in the direction of leveraging modern sites in SharePoint Online, you really should be thinking about it. So it's going to be a different model, but our behavior as users and our expectation as users hasn't really changed. So while the underlying architecture of how it's implemented has, the way we expect a site to behave and work hasn't really changed. So that's kind of an interesting dichotomy in learning about modern sites, site hubs, and navigation schemas for modern sites. We need to think about how that's going to work technically, but the same principles apply as far as creating, a topical structure that is balanced at every level of your taxonomy and follows a logical progression that makes sense to your users and has labels and names that resonate with the lowest common denominator of your users. So, then creating your categorization structure for your document repositories, and for each repository, it's important to consider your distinctions. So, how can you create different content types for the different repositories? Are there any global content types that will be applicable? And then the last piece, number 5, defining your metadata attributes and how that influences findability and searchability, filtered navigation, and your content types. So, we would always think about information architecture in SharePoint Online as, your sitemap, your site navigation, and then document library structure at a global level, and then at a local level, what are the individual needs of these different document libraries and lists, and from a metadata perspective, global content types versus local content types and metadata associated with those. So the same principles haven't really changed, or the principles have not changed, but the way that they work is a little bit different. Fun. All right, strategy and considerations for each of the repositories. At the top, we have what I created in that last slide, or a couple slides ago, with the inner loop, outer loop, and the repository. So individual content being OneDrive for Business, team content, whatever that ends up being for you. Department content, video libraries, social collaboration networks, knowledge base, community practice, and then finally records. So you can see how we go from individual content all the way up to records for the enterprise content. What type of organization on the vertical, on the left, what type of organization should it have? What kind of categorization should you be thinking about creating and applying to these different areas? Should this area have metadata? Content types, should these areas have content types? And then should you also be thinking about naming conventions that you want to institute? So I've gone through and I've created some guidance here, and this is more of a takeaway than something I'm really going to spend a lot of time on. Really the idea here is that you'll notice the progression, that it goes from much looser governance to more tight governance as you get to the records end of it. But hopefully this can give you an idea of what your plan should be to work through the IA for these different ideas. So document lifecycle. This is another question, because we want to manage and retain final versions, and we want to be able to make sure that we are thinking through the content management of how documents get created to perhaps what we might want to save and file as a record for the organization. So this is going to go to say that you have a records management schema in place, and you have a schedule in place, and you've identified the content types that are applied or declared as records for your organization. This is something completely outside of all Office 365, outside of all technology, really, that you should figure out and come up with, or realize you have and figure out the electronic version of applying it. But this is just my vision of the document lifecycle, and something that we have applied to a couple of customers in leveraging the different workloads, the flow of content, and how you move through those different boxes of being in your inner loop to your outer loop, and then as a final document that rests in an enterprise repository. So you create a document. You can create it with Office. It can be something you found out of Delve, a reuse. It could be from Yammer. And then you create the new document, and you would store it either in your OneDrive for Business or a team. You move into multiple author collaboration. And again, these are the workloads that you would potentially maybe use for those. It moves on to a final draft, and then you're able to publish the document. And when I say publish, I mean you just have the final version that you're ready to open up to a much larger audience. So you have your published document, then you move, and perhaps this document, this deliverable, is able to be created as a best practice or a policy or a reference guide for a process or any other kind of knowledge or expertise, intellectual property. That's what I was looking to say. And then you're able to potentially save this file as a record and declaring it a record for the organization. So using this flow and thinking through how documents move through Office 365 and how they end up in the right repository that you want it to end up in. And, you can use tools like Flow to help denote some of these actions and the movement of content within Office 365. So there can be automation applied to this, but of course you definitely need to have the content types worked out and some of the other attributes associated, the metadata associated for these documents worked out in order to create that automation. But just mapping out that process and then thinking through, okay, well, how will a user go through this process? How does a document physically get from different locations, and how do we manage duplication? How do we manage integrity and integrity of the files and whatnot? Okay, we are winding down. So we have gone through quite a bit in defining your KM strategy for Office 365. So this is kind of a summary here. The first question I pose to you all is, how should Office 365 fit in your organization? And I wanted to show and share with you a few techniques that I use as far as mapping out the workloads, evaluating the maturity and the capability of those tools to fit into specific use cases that I know that my organization has. So you're defining the value and you're aligning the workloads with the intention of what goals you're looking to achieve through it. Then we move into design, information architecture, governance, and use cases for that. And then the last piece being change management and adoption. And so this is probably the one piece that we aren't really touching on in this conversation, the change management and adoption piece. There could be an entire hour probably on this next that we could do to continue the conversation. But Office 365 is going to keep on changing. It's moving at a very, very rapid pace, and our policies should reflect our ability to introduce some of that change. So with that, we have a couple of offers out there. If you would like a consultation on your knowledge management strategy and getting started, that's definitely something that we could do, and we could get something scheduled. We also have a white paper on the business value of Office 365, but we have about 6 minutes remaining or so. So Sasha, should we do a couple of questions?
Sure, we can fit a couple in. There's one referring to your graphic where you have the outer and the inner loop, and someone has pointed out or asked that SharePoint / intranet isn't in the outer loop for the whole organization. So I think you just wanted a clarification there.
Yeah, and that was intentional because I'm talking specifically about communication, and I'm talking about where you start conversations. So if you're using the inner loop, outer loop graphic to depict when you use what workload, and it doesn't really matter communication or content management, yes, SharePoint would be in that outer loop arguably you could say SharePoint would be in the inner loop as well. I was really trying to hit home the communication aspect of, where do you start a conversation, and where that conversation starts is where that conversation ends up living. And if you're looking to improve transparency and tacit knowledge capture, then that where the conversation starts and where it lives is a really important concept to make sure that people are starting the conversation where you want them to, so that it can be discoverable by other peers in that particular group. But yes, SharePoint could be in the outer loop. It could also be in the inner loop for content management.
Got it. Thank you. And then somebody I think it's a good question. Just to clarify, is something going to happen between Teams and Skype for business? Will one be eliminated going forward?
So in the roadmap and at Ignite, Microsoft announced that the Skype for Business team was moving into Teams, and that eventually what Microsoft aims to do is to fold Skype for Business capabilities into Teams capabilities. So right now you have a host of capabilities in Teams already that supports chatting, telephony, and calls and meetings. So you can already do some of that in Teams today. Skype still does it slightly better. But we're starting to see, and what the roadmap for Office 365 indicates is that these capabilities are going to get stronger, and they're going to keep coming over into the Teams framework. And eventually, what I'm sure we'll eventually see is Skype for Business will no longer receive any updates, and then Skype for Business will probably be deprecated in 15 or 20 years, who knows, something like that. It won't go away anytime soon.
Got it. Let's see. With the new flat architecture, every new team or group is a separate site collection. With no sub-site hierarchy, doesn't this greatly complicate IA and navigation?
It does. And that's one of the reasons why I was really emphasizing naming convention. And before, because of hierarchy, because of the control we had over what site collections got created, and especially in an on-prem world where you really care about how many site collections you have so that you can manage database size and infrastructure and whatnot, it just isn't a consideration here. So the flat structure promotes the creation of additional site collections. So And it's very easy. And with the creation of a new team, you could create the name of a team that you may eventually want as a separate site, even though you're getting a site in SharePoint with your team. Does that make sense? So thinking through the naming convention of how you want to name things that you name in teams versus things you name in groups versus sites that you have, and if it's associated with your intranet versus it's just some other site collection that you're using for some other purpose, it becomes more and more important.
Okay. And then let's see, I think we have time for just one more. How mature is Yammer in its integration with SharePoint? For example, at the moment, we have SharePoint Social embedded in our SharePoint 2013 knowledge base and want to retain that moving forward to Office 365. Is that possible?
There are migration tools, I believe, that migrate the social features in SharePoint 2013. But my suggestion to you would be to figure out a way to keep those conversations, save those conversations. I'm sorry, guys. I think I have to cough.
No.
I made it all webinar.
You did. That was good.
But consider moving to Yammer or consider moving to Teams as a replacement for the SharePoint 2013 social features.
Okay. Got it. And then I think we have time just for one more, and then if there's any other ones, we can address them certainly via email later. Let me see here. How does the Teams group email interface with Outlook?
So Teams email notifications would be different than a group conversation showing up in Outlook. So the Teams notifications look like a notification from a separate application. Outlook groups and any conversations that you have in an Outlook group will appear actually like it looks like an email from that group name. So if I had so if I have a group called, Knowledge Cam at Withum Digital, and Sasha and I are members of that group, and I post a question in that conversation, it's going to show up in my Outlook inbox as Cam for Withum Digital with the message from me in there. So it looks more like an email, and it kind of acts like a distribution list. And so there's definitely differences in the user experience there, which is one of the reasons why I'm not discounting Outlook groups, because it is an underlying architecture, but the user interface is very different. And some users may really like that because they are really comfortable working in Outlook. So I think it's definitely something to evaluate.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jill. We're just a minute past our time, so I think we should wrap it up here. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And we will send out the recording and slide deck shortly this afternoon. Is there anything else, Jill?
No, I'm good on my end, and thank you, everyone, for your time, questions, and attention.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.